Freedom is never a gift. It is a struggle carved out of resistance. For decades, Africa carried one of the highest internet costs in the world, forced to send its digital lifeblood across oceans before it could return to its own children. Imagine a letter to your neighbor traveling first to Paris, London, or Seattle. That was not metaphor. That was daily life. It was the 21st century echo of colonial trade routes, updated in fiber and code. And then came a voice. A young soldier turned head of state, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, daring to ask, why must the continent of 1.4 billion remain chained to someone else's cables? Why should the farmer in Ouagadougou or the student in Nairobi pay tribute to Silicon Valley just to connect with their own community? His answer was bold. Africa would build its own highways of data, its own centers of knowledge, its own destiny. Stay with us. This is not just technology. It is history being rewritten. Subscribe now and walk with us through this turning point. But here lies the question. Is this the dawn of a new digital sovereignty, or the spark of a confrontation that could shake the global order? For generations, Africa's story of independence was told through its soil and its mines. Gold, cocoa, cotton, uranium. Each resource carried a memory of extraction, of wealth flowing outward while dependency remained within. But in the digital age, a new kind of resource emerged. Data. Invisible, weightless, and yet more valuable than oil, it traveled unseen beneath oceans. And here too, Africa's position was the same. Dependent, delayed, disempowered. Every search query in Ghana, every school assignment in Kenya, every payment in Burkina Faso had to leave the continent first. Servers in Europe or the United States processed the request, then returned it to the sender, sometimes seconds later, sometimes minutes. The logic was absurd, like mailing a letter to your neighbor but sending it across the Atlantic first. And yet this absurdity was daily reality for millions of Africans. The cost was not only in time, it was in dignity and in money. Families in Ouagadougou or Lagos spent a disproportionate share of their income just to keep their children connected to school. Entrepreneurs in Nairobi lost opportunities because their websites loaded too slowly compared with competitors abroad. A continent of 1.4 billion people, rich in languages and histories, was forced to rent its place on somebody else's network. This was not by accident. The architecture of the internet mirrored the architecture of empire. Power was concentrated in the hands of a few corporations, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, who acted not merely as service providers but as toll collectors. Every African interaction passed through their gates. Algorithms shaped what people saw, which voices were amplified and which were buried. A student in Dakar researching the Mali Empire often found more about Napoleon than about Sundiata Keita. The digital mirror reflected someone else's story, not Africa's. In this system of dependence, Africans were not the architects of the digital age. They were tenants on rented land, and tenants, no matter how long they stay, are always reminded that they do not own the property. It was into this landscape that Ibrahim Traoré stepped. At barely his mid-30s, the young president of Burkina Faso began to speak words that startled both his allies and his critics. He declared that sovereignty was not just a matter of borders or gold buried under the ground. Sovereignty, he argued, must extend into the invisible infrastructure of everyday life. If we do not control our knowledge, we do not control our future, he told his people. His vision was both simple and radical. Africa would no longer send its lifeblood of data through the hands of others. It would build its own digital highways, fiber optic cables stretching across deserts and jungles, data centers humming in capitals from Dakar to Nairobi, protocols designed not for compatibility with Silicon Valley, but for freedom in African languages and needs. To some, this sounded like an impossible dream. To others, it was déjà vu. Another promise that would be broken. Another grand announcement destined for dusty shelves of failed projects. But to the young generation who had grown up with smartphones in their hands, yet felt invisible in the global digital order, Traoré's words carried fire. They recognized themselves in his defiance, in his refusal to inherit dependence disguised as progress. And so the stage was set. A continent weary of paying tribute to distant corporations was now asked to choose between two paths. The first was safe, to continue with the old order, slow speeds, high prices, foreign dominance. The second was dangerous, costly, uncertain, resisted by powerful interests, but it carried the promise of dignity. The question was no longer abstract. It was a decision that would define whether the next generation of Africans would remain passengers on someone else's road or drivers building highways of their own. The moment of choice had arrived. But when a small, landlocked nation like Burkina Faso dares to challenge a digital empire, can it survive the backlash that follows? Every great story reaches a point of no return, the moment when hesitation gives way to action. For Africa, that moment arrived when the first strands of fiber optic cables began to snake across its soil. Through deserts that once carried caravans of salt and gold, through jungles that had resisted empires for centuries, a new infrastructure was born. Thin lines of glass carrying not trade caravans but light itself. Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré, was not the wealthiest, nor the most technologically advanced, but it was the boldest. It spoke words others only whispered. It placed a wager that sovereignty was worth the risk. Alongside neighboring nations, it began constructing a continental internet exchange. 100,000 kilometers of fiber, 47 major data centers, and a protocol deliberately incompatible with Silicon Valley's monopoly. The scale of ambition invited mockery. Western analysts dismissed it as symbolic, predicting decades of delay. Lobbyists for Google and Microsoft warned governments of instability, insisting that only their systems could guarantee reliability. In Paris and Washington, policymakers whispered about the dangers of digital fragmentation. Yet in Ouagadougou, the work did not stop. Engineers laid cables under the scorching sun. Students volunteered to test new platforms. Governments pooled resources that many thought impossible to unite. And then, the switch was flipped. Within days, over 200 million Africans migrated to the new network. No social media platform in history, not Facebook, not TikTok, not WhatsApp, had ever seen such rapid adoption. Executives in Silicon Valley convened emergency meetings. The crisis was not simply about competition. The new African protocol had been designed to be incompatible with theirs. Google's crawlers could not index it. Microsoft's cloud could not penetrate it. For the first time, the monopoly was broken at the root. On the ground, the impact was immediate. In Nairobi, students streamed entire lectures without interruption. In Lagos, businesses processed payments without routing through European servers. In Ouagadougou, farmers accessed apps built in their own languages. What had been an abstract promise became a lived reality. For families, it meant choosing groceries without sacrificing school internet fees. For doctors, it meant sharing patient data securely without foreign surveillance. For journalists, it meant searching for African history and finding their own voices first. The emotional resonance was electric. Traoré's line, "Dependence ends the day we decide it ends," spread like wildfire across social media, painted on murals, repeated in chants at rallies. Young Africans claimed it as their rallying cry, a sentence that turned frustration into pride. Hashtags trended: Africa Connected, Sovereign, Now, Trovision. Clips of students celebrating seamless connections went viral, reaching millions in hours. But triumph was never unchallenged. In Washington, congressional hearings debated whether sanctions could be justified under the banner of digital security. European governments feared the loss of cultural influence, the weakening of narratives they had shaped for decades. Tech giants, once untouchable, now scrambled to adapt, lobbying both African and Western governments for compromise. Inside Africa, too, doubts remained. Could local infrastructure handle billions of transactions daily? Could engineers sustain a network that even trillion-dollar corporations found challenging? Civil society groups warned of the danger that governments might use newfound control to silence dissent. Independence, they said, must not become authoritarianism in disguise. Yet for all the resistance, the tide had turned. A generation that had been told it was too dependent too underdeveloped, too fragmented, had proved otherwise. The unimaginable had become real, and once freedom is tasted, it cannot easily be forgotten. Still, a question lingered. Heavier than fiber cables and more fragile than glass, could Africa defend this victory against both external pressure and internal temptation? When the cables lit up and the first wave of users connected, the impact rippled far beyond the technical. It touched the most intimate corners of daily life. A mother in Ouagadougou no longer had to choose between buying groceries and paying exorbitant fees to keep her children online for school. A farmer in Bobo Dioulasso checked weather patterns and market prices instantly, protecting his harvest from exploitation. In Nairobi, students streamed African history lectures that were finally prioritized in search results, no longer buried beneath pages of Western narratives. What had been promised as sovereignty in fiber and code revealed itself as sovereignty in dignity. For years, Africans had paid one of the highest internet costs in the world while receiving some of the slowest speeds. The new network overturned this injustice in days. The symbolism was powerful. A continent that had long exported raw resources and imported finished goods was now circulating its own invisible wealth, data, within its borders. Money that once drained outward now seeded local jobs, trained engineers, and fueled startups. The social consequences were profound. Teachers shared resources with remote classrooms without delay. Doctors in rural Burkina Faso exchanged patient data securely, saving lives that distance once endangered. Journalists found African sources rising to the top of their searches. Even entertainment shifted. Young coders built apps that reached millions in neighboring countries within weeks, platforms rooted not in California but in Lagos, Nairobi, and Accra. Yet the story was never only about convenience. It was about power. For the first time, Africans became creators, not mere consumers in the digital age. The balance of influence began to tilt. Governments gained leverage, able to negotiate with foreign corporations from a position of strength rather than dependency. Leaders invoked the achievement as proof that sovereignty was more than rhetoric. It was infrastructure, tangible and visible. This was particularly true in Burkina Faso, where the young president's gamble began. For many, this project became synonymous with his vision for the nation. The phrase Ibrahim Traoré legacy appeared not only in speeches but in everyday conversations. His critics argued that it was too soon to speak of legacies, but his supporters insisted that to give a people dignity in their own knowledge, to return control of their own digital lifeblood, was already a legacy greater than monuments or treaties. Still, politics within the continent were complex. Some governments feared losing influence if a truly pan-African network eclipsed their national controls. Civil society groups cautioned against replacing one monopoly with another, this time domestic rather than foreign. Activists demanded transparency, insisting that sovereignty must serve citizens, not merely empower governments. The debate was fierce, yet it was a sign of something larger. Africa was no longer a passive recipient of technology, but an active shaper of its digital order. Even disagreements marked progress, because they unfolded on African terms, not dictated by Silicon Valley boardrooms. Internationally, the change altered diplomacy. Western powers could no longer take African dependency for granted. Negotiations on trade, aid, and security now had to account for a continent asserting control over its digital arteries. The very act of sovereignty reshaped the bargaining table. For ordinary Africans, this was not abstract geopolitics. It was felt in the reduced cost of a transaction, the speed of a download, the pride of seeing their own history appear first in their own language. But the transformation raised new questions. Would this newfound independence endure under pressure? Could African leaders resist the temptation to use digital control for censorship rather than liberation? And most of all, could the momentum of unity be maintained in a continent so vast, so diverse, and so often divided by external interests? For every story of harvest comes the question of whether the season can be repeated. Africa had sown seeds of digital sovereignty. But could it cultivate a lasting future from this fragile beginning? No revolution unfolds in isolation. The cables that connected Africa inward also sent shockwaves outward, reverberating through the corridors of power in Washington, Paris, Brussels, and Beijing. What had begun as a technical project quickly became a diplomatic earthquake. In Washington, the mood was tense. Congressional hearings echoed with warnings that Africa's digital sovereignty could fragment the global internet. Tech CEOs lobbied furiously, urging policymakers to consider sanctions or new regulations. The language was telling. When the United States defended its own data, it was called national security. When Africa did the same, it was branded destabilizing. This double standard did not go unnoticed. Paris and Brussels were equally uneasy. European governments feared the erosion of their cultural and political influence over regions they had long considered part of their orbit. French media spoke of digital secession, casting Africa's move as reckless rather than revolutionary. Yet even as they criticized, European corporations scrambled to find ways to adapt, aware that ignoring a market of over 1 billion people was no longer an option. The African Union, by contrast, claimed the initiative as proof that Pan-African unity was possible beyond speeches and summits. Leaders across the continent hailed the project as the first step towards a future of genuine independence. They framed it not as isolation, but as integration on African terms. Elsewhere, the echoes grew. In South America, governments studied the model with fascination, debating whether their own regional networks could mirror Africa's success. In Asia, nations experimenting with digital sovereignty now had living proof that independence at scale was achievable. Suddenly, what had been dismissed as fantasy was being discussed in foreign ministries and corporate boardrooms across the globe. And yet the reactions revealed the stakes. To some, Africa's boldness was a threat. To monopoly, to established narratives, to the geopolitical balance. To others, it was a correction long overdue, a rebalancing of a digital order that had grown lopsided. In Burkina Faso itself, Traore cast the achievement not as an end, but as a beginning. He spoke of a horizon larger than fiber cables and data centers, a vision of what sovereignty might mean for generations to come. Analysts began referring to it as the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a blueprint for a continent that would no longer be dictated to, but would instead chart its own path in technology, economy, and governance. But visions are fragile. The question facing Africa was not only whether it could build independence, but whether it could sustain it under the relentless weight of external pressure and internal complexity. The world was watching. The test had only just begun. The journey of sovereignty is never a straight road. It bends with obstacles, climbs with resistance, and often tests the endurance of those who walk it. Africa's digital revolution, born in defiance and built with fragile glass threads, now faces its greatest challenge: survival beyond the moment of triumph. The risks are real. Pressure from abroad will not disappear. Silicon Valley may seek to buy influence through partnerships, investment, or subtle dependency disguised as cooperation. Western governments may deploy the language of cybersecurity to justify sanctions or diplomatic isolation. Even within Africa, divisions could weaken unity, as some states prioritize national interest over continental solidarity. Equally pressing are the dangers from within. With new power comes temptation. Civil society groups warn that sovereignty must not become a tool for censorship or authoritarian control. The same infrastructure that liberates could, in careless hands, be used to silence dissent. To defend freedom requires discipline, not only defiance. Yet the opportunities are just as profound. For the first time in history, Africa holds the capacity to shape its digital order on its own terms. By keeping $50 billion of digital services within its borders, it can fund schools, employ engineers, and seed industries that transform entire economies. Universities can become hubs of innovation, not just consumers of foreign knowledge. Young coders in Lagos, Nairobi, or Ouagadougou can build platforms that reach millions without seeking permission from distant gatekeepers. The political implications are equally significant. A continent long treated as dependent now negotiates with leverage. When Africa sits at global tables on trade, climate, or security, It does so not as a supplicant, but as a partner. Sovereignty has shifted from rhetoric into infrastructure, visible in every fiber cable, every data center, every click that no longer crosses oceans. Most importantly, a psychological barrier has been broken. For centuries, Africans were told they were too fragmented, too underdeveloped, too dependent to build at scale. The Internet revolution has proved otherwise. It has shown that unity is possible, that ambition can become reality, that dignity can be coded into the very architecture of daily life. And so the road stretches forward. It will not be easy. There will be storms of opposition, seasons of doubt, moments of fatigue. But each step carries a truth that cannot be erased. That freedom is not given, it is built. Africa has begun building. The question now is whether the harvest will match the seed. Will the next generation inherit not only networks of fiber, but networks of solidarity? Will sovereignty endure not just as infrastructure, but as a lived reality of dignity? The answer lies ahead, on a road that Africa must walk with its own hands, its own sweat, its own heart. The story of Africa's digital revolution is more than cables and code. It is a mirror of centuries, where gold, cocoa, and cotton once flowed outward, and where now even the invisible wealth of data had been leaving the continent. Today that flow has begun to reverse. What was once dependency has turned into dignity, and what was once silence now speaks with its own voice. In Burkina Faso, a young president stood before his people and declared that sovereignty must not only be spoken, it must be built. Out of that conviction emerged a movement that reached far beyond Ouagadougou, touching villages, cities, and hearts across the continent. For many, this achievement is already remembered as the Ibrahim Traoré legacy, proof that leadership can be measured not only in speeches, but in the infrastructures that free a people. Yet this is not the end of the story. The road to independence is never walked once. It must be defended, renewed, and carried forward by each generation. That is why analysts now speak of the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a horizon where Africa stands not as a tenant of global systems, but as an architect of its own. A horizon where sovereignty is not a fragile exception, but the durable rule. The challenge is immense. External pressure will remain, and internal temptations will test the integrity of this achievement. But the opportunity is greater still. For the first time, Africa has shown that it can turn belief into infrastructure, conviction into cables, dignity into daily reality. And so the question extends beyond Burkina Faso, beyond Africa itself. If one continent can reclaim control of its digital lifeblood, what stops the rest of the world from asking the same? Dependence is fragile. Sovereignty is strength. The lesson belongs to all. If this moment touched you, do not let it fade. Subscribe, share this story, and let it travel further than any cable beneath the oceans. Together, let us carry forward the seed of freedom until it grows into a forest of dignity. In the end, the Ibrahim Traoré legacy will not be measured only by what was built, but by how far the idea of sovereignty can inspire others to rise.